Hi, this is Dr. Pike again for LDR350. Our book this week is Leading with Communication, and we're covering Chapter 9, which is Leading the Way Through Conflict by Gamble and Gamble. Leaders need energy to respond to setbacks, a willingness to change, a spirit of partnership, and the knowledge that it takes a team to yield consistent results. Additionally, leaders need an openness to respond appropriately to feedback without letting ego get in the way, awareness of shared responsibility, and the ability to embrace change and make that mid-course correction. Thinking about conflict. Negotiating a conflict is a necessary leadership competency. Disagreements are normal, but how conflict is handled reveals the health of the leader's relationship with those in conflict. Leaders must balance and coordinate the emerging competing interests so that the benefit to the public or organization or group as a whole, and not go back to their own self-serving interests or those of any one party. A leader's goal should be to have those facing conflict use the conflict as a motivator. It can be a force for stimulating learning and innovation, a means for clarifying problems we did not see or understand before, and we can understand the interdependence on those problems that may be underlying some of the decisions that we have to make. When we're talking about different kinds of conflicts, we're talking about personal conflicts, interpersonal conflicts, conflicts occurring between competing groups. Some are conflicting in the open. Others are underground and often exacerbated by hidden agendas that can be very powerful forces. Leadership expert Warren Bennis identified a series of internal conflicts he categorizes conflict and their resolution. And that's what we're looking at on this slide. If we see blind trust versus suspicion, our resolution is hope. Interdependence versus dependence, our resolution is autonomy. Initiation versus imitation, we find our resolution to be purpose. Industry versus inferiority, we find the resolution being competence. Identity versus confusion, our resolution is integrity. If we're looking at intimacy versus isolation, the resolution can be empathy. Generosity versus selfishness, well, that's defeated by maturity. Illusion versus delusion, and our resolution to that is wisdom. Now, knowing how to handle conflict is a leadership requirement, and we discussed that before, but where it begins is in self-reflection, looking in and out. Leaders need to handle and not mangle conflicts. How a leader models the handling of conflicts after a decision making and the satisfaction of those who work with that leader is most important. A leader mangles handling conflict by engaging in one of the following behaviors. Attacking, and this is done when the leader's tone becomes sarcastic. They attempt to inflict guilt on the disagreeing person, or a leader can actually inflame conflict. Acting defensively, and this will signal their displeasure, and it limits the opportunities for resolution. Stonewalling is refusing to acknowledge or talk about differences, and these individuals can build a wall in between open communication. Communicating contempt. The relationship has entered a dangerous territory by this point. The leader manages conflict skillfully when he or she engages in dialogue, speaking respectfully in a non-threatening manner. They converse to be understood and not to win the conflict. And finally, it's about embarking on an exploration of possible ways to resolve the conflict. As a responsible leader, you want to adopt a cooperative mindset as a way to resolve conflict to each person's mutual satisfaction, and I'll add benefit. Conflict should enrich and not destroy. When parties to a conflict view it cooperatively and look for a mutually beneficial way to resolve it, conflict is defined as a common problem and each person works to understand the other party's position through role reversal. Leaders need to fully face and comprehend the situation if they are to be able to fix it. When we're speaking about verbal aggressiveness, the tactics to avoid include personal insults, attacks on character, competence, or appearance, threats or profane remarks, looks of disgust, aggressive gestures. These are all blocking things to open communication. If leaders are surrounded by people who let them make mistakes instead of helping them to face reality and correct their courses of action, they become impeders rather than facilitators of effective leadership. They just simply get in your way. If you have disgust for these people, they're going to understand and know it. If you want to build a person and their skill set, then you want to be nurturing, especially when they make right choices. Now, when we're speaking about this, we want to talk about the positive ways in which we can react. And this is when you're making an argument, the tactics to embrace are the leader will state his or her claim or conclusion. They'll present supporting evidence, statistics and examples, illustrations or testimony, list reasons or rationales for the leader's position, and conclude with a summary statement reiterating what the leader is asking for. It's clear, concise communication, but you also offer the other party, the differing party, the ability to state their opinion, and you'll want to listen for it. Now, when we're talking about interaction, what begins as a disagreement and exploration of opposing views can sometimes deteriorate into hostile exchanges or accusations. Developing an awareness of options in the communication practices can help prepare a leader to diffuse rather than escalate the conflict. And we just went over those tactics to utilize and the ones to refrain from. There is a critical startup period of a conflict, and this is setting the tone. If criticism is used early in a conflict, it quickly becomes negative. Using "you never," "you always" has a destructive effect. Substituting "I" statements that describes a concern can transform criticism into constructive complaints. If defensiveness predominates during a conflict, individuals usually engage in a power struggle. People become defensive when they feel attacked. Support has the opposite effect. A person must feel heard and listened to in order to understand what he or she can disagree, but still have the leader's support. Back to stonewalling, when we're talking about building these walls, if we're critical at the very initial onset of a conflict, we can create a situation to where that person doesn't want to hear anything that we have to say. And this usually occurs when people sense hostility. By asking others directly what they're thinking, you may be able to pull them back into productive discussion. Expressing contempt for another usually results in a spiral of destructive communication. People need to learn to voice their concerns. Can there be too much agreement? Now, when we're talking about these things, we're talking about the leader's view of conflict and how it permeates their team. When a member senses that a leader is inhibiting conflict, they begin to do the same. This can cause the team to avoid a realistic view of situations and courses of action. Concurrence seeking limits discussion because the concurrence seeker's goal is to avoid arguments. Compromise can be considered a lose-lose approach, and this is what we call groupthink. Groupthink, it's whatever methodology there is to preserve a harmonious atmosphere, and it can create stagnation in organizations. Members set aside misgivings and doubts about a decision or policy in favor of agreeing with each other and achieving consensus. The outcome of groupthink is conformity. Rationalizations are occurring. Illusions are preventing anyone from questioning or challenging courses of action. A sense of invulnerability prevails, the unquestioning belief that the ideas individuals are holding are correct and morally right. All of this blinds the participants to the potential dangers and prevents them from thinking critically. Groupthink has devastating effects on organizations. Now, your book describes several. Past page 175, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the reason for the Challenger explosion, the Challenger space shuttle upon takeoff, the reason for the disintegration of the Columbia shuttle upon re-entry. Leadership failure has occurred when talking openly and honestly about what is happening or what's going on is off limits, and when facing truths is avoided at all costs. Groupthink stifles healthy conflict. To combat groupthink, leaders should encourage disagreement, demonstrate your openness to dissent, ask different people to function as critical evaluators so that courses of action are questioned and assessed dispassionately. Remove yourself from some of the meetings so that others who may be reticent to voice their concerns in your presence will feel freer to do so. Solicit advice from outside experts and pay careful attention to the risks that they see. Encourage people to turn conflict into positive force by playing devil's advocate and openly challenge others to defend their positions and decisions. Recognize that silence does not connote agreement. Let people voice their thoughts anonymously in writing. Hold secret rather than hand votes. Take time to understand your DQ, or disagreement quotient. Leaders with a high tolerance for disagreement do not let conflicts become negative. They want thoughtful and careful colleagues to work with. Leaders with a low tolerance for disagreement discourage critical inquiry by reaching with hostility, including verbal aggressiveness toward those who dissent. This puts the organization at risk. A leader's DQ is also affected by their understanding of diverse attitudes towards conflict due to cultural and gender differences. Leaders need to be prepared to adapt for cultural variations. And that is the end of Chapter 9 for this week. Students, thank you. I know you've worked very hard up until this point. This is your 5th week of this course. We're just coming out of midterms, and I hope everyone participated in the mid-course survey so we better understand how to present these courses and meet the demands for the non-traditional student. Now, I want to say thank you for the fantastic work that you've been submitting. It makes it a pleasure to read and a pleasure to grade. And with that, I'll say to you good night and see you next week.